Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello and welcome to The Money Factor. I'm Richard Naylor, your host. Our topic today is regional planning, and our guest is Rocco Ferraro, Executive Director of the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. I want to welcome you, Rocco.
Thank you. Nice being here.
You were the first guest on my first show, and so it's kind of a little aside there, but
It's great to be back. It's
Great
great to be back here.
What you're working on is really everybody's business, and as a board member long ago said to me, everybody's business is nobody's business. So I guess our job is trying to explain to people why it really is critical that we do regional planning.
Well, it's very important to the extent in terms of developing methods to provide more efficient service delivery programs to the residents of the region, having the region be an attractive place to do business. Municipal boundaries are not necessarily the topic of conversation when it comes to making business decisions, in as much as what is the quality of life of that region, what does it have to offer. And certainly there's been successes in other parts of the country showing that, but regions that work collaboratively together are more successful than parochial attitudes that may exist.
Let's go back just a little bit and talk about the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. I know you work with other organizations, and I'm not sure everybody is familiar with your mission.
Okay, well basically, we serve 4 counties: Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties. And I have a 20-member board. 5 members are appointed from each of those 4 counties. And basically, our overall mission is to be a resource center for planning and data research that's necessary in the capital region in a collaborative, cooperative, coordinated fashion. So we do not have any regulatory authorities in terms of our responsibilities, but certainly we make ourselves accessible to the community in terms of the research that they may be doing and participating in order to enhance the quality of life for the residents and the businesses in the region.
Of course, planning is not a new thing in the area. We've had town planners and regional planners for many years, but I think the NANO project, the success we've had at the University at Albany and RPI and some of the universities has really focused people's attention and also hopes and expectations a little bit more on this growth. Has that brought more of a focus to your organization?
Well, certainly it has, and especially in collaboration. There's a recognition that we can't look at, when we talk about growth, it's not just economic growth, it's the impact on the environment, social service delivery programs, and enhancing the overall, once again, the quality of life of the residents in the capital region. So it requires a collaborative process that engages a variety of individuals and entities in the discussion, be it the public sector, the private sector, the educational community, the nonprofit sector. And certainly in the last half a dozen years or so, that those dialogues and discussions have been enhanced tremendously for the benefit of everyone in the region.
I think as we lay the basis for the conversation, it might be good to, at this point, because you mentioned all of those major areas, to also go into some of the details of what those are. In other words, roads, things that are real that people relate to.
Okay, well, the infrastructure in terms of when you're talking about growth and accommodating growth in an efficient manner, you're looking at first the major infrastructure issues, be it the availability of transportation systems, be it roads, light rail, or buses, as well as pedestrian, non-motorized opportunities. You're talking about the availability of sewer lines and water lines, not just the extensions of those lines, but the need to invest in our existing infrastructure. As we found out in Troy earlier this week, that there was some explosions, underground explosions. We hear about all the time in our cities across the country about problems with existing infrastructure and the need to invest in existing infrastructure while at the same time investing in new infrastructure. So all these things contribute to the services that are necessary to accommodate a population and community. And then you bring in the layers of school, the need for educational facilities in the region, and then the support services such as the libraries, how they tie into that, the emergency service protection measures that are all
Right.
these are all part of the total system that have to be evaluated, and what is the most efficient way to provide those services to the residents of the community.
And certainly, as we were talking before, the housing and where and how people live is a major focus of what you do.
And we have to be careful because everyone has different values and different quality of lives. Certainly what I consider a quality of life to meet my personal needs is different than the next person. So what we have to do a little bit more effectively in the region is to expand the opportunities in terms of enhancing the quality of life for the residents of the region in terms of their housing choices. And traditionally, in terms of the capital region, we've had more of a single-family home on a quarter, half, 1 acre parcels of land, which is a more spread out pattern of development. And certainly there are persons or householders interested in that type of environment, but there's also those householders interested in more urban type of setting as well. Also introducing more mixed-use opportunities, not just to segregate the land uses, but to have a more mixed-use integration of the land use activities. So it allows people to walk, to get to the services they need. And as the population ages, and certainly our region, similar to other parts of the country, the baby boom generation, there's going to be need for services that are more in closer proximity to the housing units than they traditionally have been in the past, in particular in many of our suburban settings.
So you mentioned that different people have different preferences, and I guess we mentioned a little bit before the show started, the images of places vary and what people expect. And so if I might really like to be able to walk to a coffee shop without getting in my car, especially on a beautiful day like today, I wouldn't dare from here go over to Professor Jobbitt's, for example, because crossing the street might not be very good.
There's always going to be hazards in place. When it's much easier to design something new than to try to retrofit. So in a number of our cities, they have been traditionally pedestrian friendly because they were developed before the automobile became the dominant feature of means of transportation. Plus, in our urban settings, in many of our cities, we had a mixed-use pattern of land use that existed, where we had the offices very close by to the residential, as well as stores on the lower floor, apartments on the upper floors, things like that. In our suburban growth trends, it's been much more segregated in terms of land use patterns, and the automobile became the dominant focus. That's why we see large expanses of parking. When you walk, when you go to the shopping centers, it's parking in front, buildings set back 100, 200, 300 feet away, versus in our downtown settings, they're much closer they're fronting on the sidewalk. We have recognized over the last half a dozen years or so, maybe last 10 years or so, the importance of the pedestrian component in our design as a means of getting up from one place to another. And we see a more aggressive attempt by communities in the capital region to incorporate pedestrian design in the planning of their community. But to retrofit it is sometimes more difficult because you have existing businesses you're dealing with, existing settings. That sometimes makes it more difficult. That being said, even on busy streets, you could introduce measures that mitigate some of the hazards that may exist. But as a pedestrian, you always have to be cautious because it's you against the automobile, and there's no contest there, even under the best of circumstances.
Right. Yeah. It's hard here to have a train, for example. There's just where do you start? Where do you end? How do people get on? How do you get there?
Well,
you'd need a car to get to it, and then a car to get to where you were going.
When we talk about light rail, since the development patterns began in this country, there's always been a link between transportation and land use. Our first development patterns occurred along the riverfronts and the waterfronts because of access vis-a-vis a boat.
Right.
And in New York State, we had the canal system that was built in the 1825, and that opened up the areas west of Albany in terms of the development opportunity. So it was water. Then we had the railroads that came into play, and obviously we had a number of communities that are like Mechanicville is named after a railroad. Same thing with the village of Delancey, the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. And that's how the village of Delancey got its name. And then we had the interstate highway system introduced, and and we see the more sprawl-like pattern that resulted because of that. So there's always been a link between transportation and land use. When we talk about light rail or other mass transit options, we have to talk about a higher density of development. You're not going to be able to accommodate you're not going to be able to justify the costs associated, the capital investment and the operating expenses associated with light rail if you do not have a component higher density development than most, if not all, our suburban communities accommodate.
So it's kind of a nodal system where the train takes a lot of people from point A to point B, but they need to be able to walk around probably from around a point.
And that's why we have what's called the transit-oriented design, TODs. And with the transit-oriented design concept, that's exactly the point. You have these nodes at these critical stops, and then you have a mixed-use, higher-density development taking place surrounding that. So it's a destination that serves a variety of functions and activities for the consumer to go there.
So what opportunities do we have going forward to get from not enough opportunities for people to do what they would like to do and having a place to live that fits their idea?
Well, yeah, and it's very difficult because we all have our value systems and things like that enter into the picture, but we have to do a much better job of linking the land use component with the transportation component at a minimum. And we have to look at development in a more sustainable way. It's not just economic issues, it's not just environmental issues, it's not just social service delivery issues. These are all combined together in a sustainable manner. So how do we develop a system that recognizes the overlapping issues associated with all of these three areas rather than looking at it as independent silos? And traditionally, we've looked at these things as independent silos. Our state departments, for example, our federal departments are all set up. You got the Department of Economic Development, the Department of Housing, Department of Environmental Conservation, each doing their own thing. There has to be more crossbreeding taking place amongst these functional planning areas in order to achieve a desired end. Now at the local level, and that's where the responsibilities come regarding land use, they have to be more focused in terms of the broader vision and then how they're going to accomplish that vision through the implementation strategies that they have in place, specifically zoning regulations, subdivision regulations, and site plan review are the three critical elements that the communities have going with them, as well as capital improvements planning and tying these things together in a more cost-effective manner.
Now, I know some of the communities, Colonie, of course, has a comprehensive plan. I guess there's two questions that occur to me with that. How do we really put that plan into play? And two, does the plan need further work?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with the details of the Colonie Comprehensive Plan. I do know, though, that they have introduced mixed-use developments. Right. So they've gotten away from the traditional suburban model of segregated land uses, residential here, commercial here, industrial here, offices someplace else, and look for more combination of activity, be it office retail together, residential retail, residential office together. So they recognize the importance of a mixed-use model and lower density or higher densities as well. But now we have to move into the implementation phase of that, and that means developing the land use regulations that would accommodate that to occur in a relatively seamless fashion. Because from the developer standpoint, he or she is making an investment decision about developing that property. They want some assurances coming in, because the timeline, they cannot wait 1, 2, 3, or 5 years before a time of initial discussion to approval, because a lot of things happen and a lot of money is spent during that time frame. We have to make the process a little bit easier. But it becomes a little more difficult because you're introducing elements that heretofore have not been totally accepted in the suburban communities, as well as by the residents.
Government or by the residents?
By the residents, because many residents, they move to a suburban community from an urban setting, and they move to a community because they like it the way it is today. That's why they moved into that particular neighborhood. Right. They like it the way it is the day they moved in there, and they don't expect change to take place, and they're concerned about the change and the impact that they may have, in particular fiscally, and on the quality of life. Right. And so the change is inevitable. And that's going to occur regardless of how we as individuals feel about it. The important question is how can we make a transformation occur that's agreeable and acceptable. And that requires education and talking about processes in education, meeting with neighborhood groups, meeting with the neighbors, not in a confrontational way, but in a more congenial fashion, outlining that we're not talking about, there's a lot of myths about density. For example, crime and density go together. That's not true. Lower income residents and density go together. That's not true. These are more urban legends than reality in terms of promoting these types of.
Is it a statistical problem? Because a lot of times people say, well, New York is much more dangerous. Look at all the number of murders. But we don't understand what 7 million people means as opposed to 5,000 people.
That's correct. But that being said, there are more. Crime is at a higher rate in our urban settings than in our suburban communities. But is that a function of land use? Or is that a function of other issues that may exist in society? Educational issues.
Social problems, yeah.
And a host of social problems that exist in terms of the family breakdown and things like that, lack of father figures or mothers, and the gang influence. And we should not be surprised that the gang influence is occurring in our suburban communities as well, regardless if you're in a single-family home on a half-acre parcel of land or if you're in a brownstone, a 3-story brownstone.
Right.
You still could be confronted with these issues. Another interesting point about the, in terms of, many of us, we move to a suburban community because we want to provide the best protection to our family, in particular our children. But one of the highest rates of death, the highest causes of death amongst teenagers is?
The car.
Bingo. And we need more access to a car in our suburban communities than we do in our urban areas.
You can't survive without a car. So I guess there are pressures on parents to get that kid in a car.
Exactly. And therefore the car is more dangerous. And, I don't like to use myself as an example, but I guess I will in this particular case. I live in a suburban location as well. And my biggest fear is my children having to go in the car and going out somewhere. Now, they know the rules of the household in terms of do not drink and drive under any circumstances. But what about the other drivers that are out there? You don't know. Whereas now my daughter, she was in Boston, now she's in New York City. I feel much safer that she was in Boston, going to school in Boston and New York City, because she doesn't have access to an automobile.
So you totally take that danger away.
And I feel, ironically, I'm more comfortable with that than the suburban enclave that they grew up in, because of my concerns about the automobile coming home at 1, 2 in the morning, 18 to 24-year-old persons and things like that, and what may be out there, lurking out there in terms of drivers on that road. I don't find that in the urban settings. As long as you're street smart in a city, you have to be street smart in terms of knowing what's going on.
You don't go in a certain neighborhood, perhaps.
Right. But you have more control of your own destiny
in
terms of that. Or you take a cab.
Somebody bumps into you on the street, you're not dead.
Right. And you avoid streets where there's no one going down that street. Right. Because a crime usually doesn't occur in areas where there's crowds of people.
Right.
It's more in isolated locations.
So. Is there a generational aspect to this? I know our planners are probably all ages. I know a few in Colonie, young to older. But we talk about college graduates. We want to keep our college graduates here. And yet what they want in conversations with them is often an environment maybe more like Boston, where it's not just that Boston is a big city, but it's also that there's a culture where people communicate in a certain way. And are we building anything for them?
Well, it's certainly the Gen X activities in the capital region are extremely positive. And that's why in the last half a dozen to 10 years, this region has come a long way in understanding the need for collaboration, coordination, intergenerational issues, and things like that. I certainly like to see more young persons involved in the planning process. I mean, serving on planning boards in our community, attending meetings when you're talking about the vision of what your community should look like, and becoming engaged at an early stage to become involved in that. young persons, it is very interesting in this region here because when we look at our college, we have a large number of colleges and universities, and we attract a lot of young people to our colleges and universities. But a fair number of those individuals who come to the capital region come from a large urban area, primarily the New York City metropolitan area.
And Long Island, I think.
And Long Island. But a large number. I teach a course at University at Albany, and I have over 100 students in my class, and every semester I ask where their geographic location is, and more than 50% come from one of the 5 boroughs in New York City. And plus you have about another 20% coming from the suburban communities. The point is that they're coming from a larger metropolitan area to a smaller metropolitan area. Now, we're never going to be able to compete with the New York Cities and things that offering the same things that New York City offers or Boston does. And for young people, there is a natural attraction when they're 20-something to move to a larger urban setting.
Okay.
But that being said, there's still a large number who would prefer like to live in the capital region, but not in a suburban location, but in a more urban location, such as Albany, Troy, Schenectady, Saratoga Springs, and have a more dynamic cultural environment with close access. So when they do go to the bars at night, for example, or other entertainment activity they may be involved with, that they could walk or take a cab or something like that to go from point A to point B. And there's a range of cultural activities that engages the younger persons in. So I think we have to have more discussion with our younger persons in the capital region. I think I don't get as concerned with the outmigration of younger persons as others do in the aggregate. Certainly we have to retain more than we have, but I don't like using that Austin model where they've done a good job in keeping the students there from the University of Texas, because most of those students come from a small town into a large urban setting, and sure, they naturally want to stay there. In our case, in many cases, they come from a larger urban setting to a smaller community, and certainly some are interested in staying here. What we may want to go after is through the alumni associations once they become 30-something.
Okay.
And say, okay, you move down to the New York City metropolitan area as a young person.
Do you like the traffic, and things like that?
You like to, and they live in the city. I mean, I know, once again, through my daughter, things like that. You got 3 or 4 people doubling, tripling up together, quadrupling up, each paying $1,500 to $2,000 a month for rent because they like, it's just trade-offs. Right. We all have trade-offs.
I just saw what it cost, I think, to buy an apartment in New York City, and it's about $1 million.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's extremely expensive. So when you're 20-something, no problem having housemates and roommates and things like that. When you become 30-something, if you get married, I'm not so sure those arrangements are as beneficial, or you want to go there. So the capital region, I think, offers an excellent alternative because we offer excellent quality of life within the capital region, and we have access to New York City. It's not that far to get down
Montreal.
there. Yeah, exactly. To Boston, Montreal, New York City, and I go to New York City quite a bit to baseball games and things like that. I'm a big Mets fan, so I'm always
Yankees over here, but right.
And in fact, I got tickets for a Yankees game in June 12th, and they just came in the mail yesterday. My mailbox did not blow up, surprisingly. So I got all my Mets tickets.
Now we probably can't cover everything that we could do. One thing we haven't covered at all is the trends, and I know the last time you were here, we talked about, you said four possibilities. You also talked to the Colonie Business Council recently and went over some of those trends. And I know at least one person in the audience was astounded what the hypergrowth percentage was. Could we go over some of that a
Sure.
little bit?
We looked at 4 alternative development scenarios in the capital region. The first is our official population projections, if you will. And over the next 30 years or so, we're projecting a population increase in the capital region of about 72,000 persons, going basically from 795 to 870,000 persons over the next 30 years.
Is that?
And that's about 1/3 of 1% per year.
Okay.
And we looked at that in the context of, okay, based on our existing growth patterns, where we expect that to occur. It's a more spread out pattern, nothing unusual about that. Continue to spread out pattern in the Northway Corridor. Suburban communities can continue to be more attractive than our urban centers. The second scenario we looked at was, once again, a same growth rate of about 1/3 of 1% per year, but we had a more concentrated growth pattern. In fact, our existing urban areas, the cities in particular and the villages, became more attractive as places to live versus the suburban locations. And we looked at that in terms of what would occur there. The third alternative we looked at was, okay, what about if our growth rate was 1% per year, which is basically 3 times our projected growth rate? Now, the 1% growth rate is based on the national growth rate. It's been projected that nationally the population will grow at 1%.
So if we were just average?
We were just average. We would have an increase of over 200,000 persons over the next 30 years or so. If we continued our existing pattern of growth, we wouldn't see much activity in our existing urban centers, but we see continued substantial growth in our suburban communities, and once rural communities will become suburbanized. And then the fourth scenario was looking at that same 1%, but a more concentrated growth pattern, once again having a more urban focus in terms of the policies and things like that. It's our belief. There's a couple things. Number one, some have suggested that our 1/3 of 1% growth rate may be too low based on our investments in nanotechnology and related activities here in the capital region, and based on models that occurred in other parts of the world, if you will, when nanotech was introduced. They had a much greater growth rate. So that's why we looked at it in that context for 1%. What we also in terms of looking at that 1%, well, what are the possibilities of having a more urban focus versus suburban focus? And when we look at strictly from a demographic standpoint, from a statistical standpoint, not a policy standpoint, from a statistical standpoint, the numbers are favorable to have an urban renaissance in the capital region. With the young persons we were talking about a few minutes ago, are generally more attractive to an urban setting, and with empty nesters. Those baby boomers that were born between 1946 and 1964, many of us raised our families in the suburban locations. There is an interest in locating to a more urban setting. And we've seen cities across the country that have been successful, either cities or neighborhoods, that have become gentrified because of the influx of in-migration of young persons and empty nesters moving in. So we have the demographics to make that work. It's the policy initiatives that have to be addressed in order to move forward to make these communities more attractive. And certainly when we look at a place like Saratoga Springs, we are not adverse to a community with smaller lots and smaller homes, because the housing prices within Central City, Saratoga Springs, are indicative of a demand that's there for smaller, maybe more luxurious, but certainly smaller accommodations on smaller parcels of land, be it a city lot, 40, 50 by 100 feet, or a condominium in a 4 or 5 or 6-story condominium unit where they're going for $500, $700, upwards of $1 million within the city of Saratoga Springs. There's no reason to suggest that cannot happen in places like Albany, Schenectady, and Troy, because we do have we have a traditional older housing stock there. However, we have to address issues, perceived or otherwise, issues associated with crime, education, and high taxes.
So we have
for
to
limited
keep
services.
focusing on that and keep people's attention on that. Otherwise, it won't happen. And what you said brought a question into my mind. We're getting near the end of the show, but at the point we are, it seems that you're saying if the natural things that are happening gives us an opportunity to actually get to where we would be a little better off. And you're saying if the policies permit that, is it enough to simply take the new parts, the new things coming in, the new dynamics, and redirect those? Would we be okay? Could we do a reasonable transit system with that? Or do we actually have to go into what's been done already and fix some of that as well?
Well, it's a combination of factors. Certainly we have to pay attention to our existing infrastructure and invest in our existing infrastructure. and see what opportunities exist, be it brownfield redevelopment, our riverfronts. Once again, as I pointed out earlier in the show, our first development occurred along our riverfronts. That was before we had environmental regulations in place and the other type of regulation. These parcels now have become underutilized in many cases. So what do we have to do to make these parcels attractive for redevelopment opportunities, to bring in the investors, the partnerships that are necessary to make this work in the cities, the river towns, be it City of Rensselaer, City of Cohoes, City of Albany, City of Troy, and points in between to make that work. So we have to have an internal investment in those communities, cities and villages, large and small, in order to put that piece of the puzzle together and make them more attractive.
It sounds possible.
It's very possible. Once again, when we look at other locations, these models have been successful, but it requires a partnership. Going back to the partnership and collaborative model that's necessary. And in terms from the government's perspective, it requires a partnership with the local governments who have land use responsibilities, regional governance, such as our organizations, the Transportation Planning Group, in terms of just having these types of dialogues, discussions, preparing reports, providing the information for the decision makers to be comfortable with their decisions, and reaching out to a variety of interest groups and stakeholders. And then also the state government, in terms of the state and federal government for that matter, have a responsibility in terms of domestic programs and providing the financial resources necessary to allow for these investments in infrastructure that cannot be strictly the burden of the city residents, because we're already a very high tax state, and our urban areas are higher tax than our suburban communities. Okay. So there is going to need for additional financial resources to make this work.
Well, on that note, I think we want to move forward. We have a lot that you've said, and there's a lot of work yet to do.
And certainly, we have a lot of assets in this region to put these pieces together, and certainly the discussion have taken place with my agency as well as other agencies. Once again, the public and the private sector, the nonprofit, the education community seem to be very positive in moving in that direction at this time. We have consensus to some of the policies that we're talking about here. Now we have to move the next step and implement those policies that we've been talking about over the last half a dozen years or so.
I think it won't be another 18 months before you're back.
Thank you. I'll be glad to return.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show. And I hope you see us next time on The Money Factor.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.